All right, we are rolling straight into another panel, which segues really well with private land ownership. Is a panel on land and water stewardship, which will be moderated by Dr. Bonnie Warnock, and so I'm going to invite them up to the after that. Dr. Warnock is a Dean of Agriculture and Life and Physical Sciences. I've known her, goodness gracious, probably 20 years. She is one of our exceptional leaders on campus and one of the best instructors we've had at Sul Ross State University. She's developed a passion for ranching because she grew up on a ranch. She grew up out here in West Texas. She has a love for nature and the outdoors, and that caused her to pursue a degree or 3 degrees in range wildlife management and soils. So, Dr. Warnock, if you would.
So thank you, Lewis, for the introduction. So good afternoon. Thank y'all for being here and coming to join the conversation on water and land stewardship. So I'll be serving as the panel moderator, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a brief introduction. But if you want to see more of their bio, you can basically click on the QR code in your program. So we'll just start here and go down the line with the introductions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Bennett. I'm with the Rio Grande Joint Venture. I'm a habitat hydrologist, and we work on streams and grassland habitats, trying to improve conditions for birds, wildlife, and ranching operations. Come from a ranching and farming family near Abilene.
Hi, I'm Catherine Eves, and I was a secondary science teacher for 25 years. I did teach some environmental advanced placement science courses, and I'm also currently an adjunct professor with a college in Houston, so distance learning, and I'm currently serving as mayor of Alpine, which is why I'm on this panel.
My name is Steve Nelly. I worked for the Natural Resources Conservation Service for 35 years, and since that time I've been involved in private consulting for 12 years. I live in San Angelo and spent a lot of time in the Edwards Plateau and the Trans-Pecos, involved in range management, wildlife management primarily.
My name's Casey Wade. I'm with the Dixon Water Foundation. I live in Marfa, Texas on the MIMS unit, ranch of the Dixon Water Foundation. We focus on healthy watersheds through good land management, which focuses mainly on grazing management. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So to kind of get the conversation started and to give a little bit of perspective, y'all just heard some great landowners talk about their experiences with ranching. And a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about with land stewardship are directly related to ranching. And so a little bit of my background, so I am also a 5th generation landowner here in the Trans-Pecos. And my paternal grandparents, both growing up in very different ranches in the Trans-Pecos. My grandmother, my Meemaw, on the Pecos River north of Dryden, and my papa on a ranch between Marathon and Sanderson with no surface water at all. And my Meemaw would joke that when she got married, she thought she'd moved to hell because there was no water. So all of the water when they first got married was catchment water. So they had dirt tanks, header dams, the first of which was actually built by an out-of-work engineer who was hoboing on the railroad track and stopped and worked for my grandparents for a while. And then dirt tanks, all of the household water was caught off roofs and into cisterns. And if it didn't rain, then they bought water from the railroad, which they then hauled in wagons and then a Model T in barrels to meet needs. So there was just this real idea that there wasn't a lot of water. The first well at the house was brought in the 1940s, and water became more available, but it wasn't a strong well. And so it pumped off, and that became particularly a problem when they put in an electric submersible. And then on the rest of the ranch, they drilled multiple wells, which were dry. Only one other well was brought in on the ranch, and it collapsed in the earthquake in the 90s. So there's over 40 miles of pipeline on that ranch trying to meet the needs for the people and the livestock on the ranch. And so then in the 1950s, my granddad got with some other area ranchers, and you actually saw two of the descendants of those folks here on stage earlier, and they formed the Big Bend Soil and Water Conservation District with the real focus on figuring out how to steward and manage lands so that we could have good water production and good grasses. And my papa was like, okay, I have a goal, and I don't want one drop of water to run off my ranch and be wasted down the railroad track. So that's really the environment that I grew up in. And so water conservation was just something that you did, and wasting water was an absolute high crime. That was not something that really you wanted to happen. And so, but when I started going to school and, staying over with my peer group, there was, hey, I turn the tap on and the water comes out. There was not this idea of water conservation. And so what we're really going to talk about today is some of those big questions about how we kind of face this dilemma when we're on and owning land, whether it's in urban or rural areas. So how do we balance the needs of the upland water infiltration and then having water in our riparian areas? How do we balance urban and rural needs? How do we meet the needs of agricultural production? And these are things that, really the landowners and the ranchers in the Trans-Pecos have been struggling with for over 100 years now. So we're going to try to kind of bring that to life and talk a little bit about the tensions and the problems that we see and how we really kind of approach those issues. So we're going to kind of start out with, what is land stewardship? So I'm going to ask Steve if he'll talk a little bit about that.
It's a great place to start. It's the right place to start because the term land stewardship has come into really popular usage over the last 20 years. But the term is seldom defined. What exactly do you mean when you say land stewardship? It has become kind of a feel-good word. Everybody wants to be thought of as a land steward. So I'm going to provide a perspective on what land stewardship is. And my concept of land stewardship doesn't come from a textbook or a classroom or anything, but I've had the privilege of working with private landowners since 1976. Now, not all landowners are land stewards, but I've had the privilege of working with some of the more exceptional land stewards across Texas. I've tried to listen to them. I've tried to watch what they do. And I think I've gathered from them collectively what genuine land stewardship is. So I want to share that with you. I think if they were here, collectively, they would say that land stewardship is really about the relationship between a person and a piece of land. Like any relationship, it can be healthy or it can be unhealthy. So land stewardship is about taking responsibility for something that you have been entrusted with. It's about your inner convictions about the land. It's about having a tender conscience toward the land. It's about the voluntary limitation of freedom that you will not allow yourself to do certain things that may be legal. Maybe the neighbors do it. So land stewardship is really about, it's really about who a person is on the inside. And there are three beneficiaries. When land is well taken care of, there's three levels of benefit. Obviously, one is it benefits the individual themselves, and that includes income and profit and financial benefit, for sure. It benefits the next generation. So people who are not even born yet someday are going to own and manage these lands. It's not going to be you, and it may or may not be someone in your family. But the third level of benefit comes to society, because what happens on the land benefits other people. It's the rippling effect. So those three levels of benefit are part of the land stewardship equation. It's good for the individual, it's good for future generations, it's good for society as a whole. And Aldo Leopold is one who probably wrote most thoughtfully about man's relationship to the land. So I would like to ask each of you to dust off your copy of a Sand County Almanac, reread it. I think it will connect very deeply with you. But the way that land stewardship is misunderstood is that too often it's equated with doing practices, with doing projects on the land. But land stewardship is not the same thing as carrying out practices. It's different. So the practices that we might do could be brush control, it could be rotational grazing, it could be prescribed burning. Those are just tools. Those are just techniques. They're not good or bad. It's like the hammer in the toolbox. It can be used beneficially if it's done skillfully, but if it's used carelessly, it causes harm. So merely doing those practices or any other does not equate with land stewardship. Land stewardship is more how those things are done and the net effect it has on the landscape. So I think they would wind up saying that land stewardship is really more about who you are on the inside. It's what motivates what you do.
So, Catherine, can you talk a little bit? So thank you, Stephen. So, this is something that's really easy to understand if you're, a rancher, you're a rural landowner. But can you talk a little bit about how we can translate that to our urban landowners?
Okay, and we certainly can. And being a teacher, I'm going to say it's education. 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 We have to educate our community leaders, our city council, our city administration, our county commissioners, our judges, our county judges. A lot of them come from non-science backgrounds, maybe not even ranching backgrounds. So they may not have an understanding. And events such as this are very important in educating our community leaders, one-on-one with land stewards and experts to teach them. And once our leaders have an understanding and they develop that sense of land stewardship, then they can bring it to the community. They can help them to understand. It might take a little bit of enticing, maybe, some kind of economic benefits. As you develop land stewardship, that's going to translate also to the water. And being in the desert, we know that's very critical. So economic benefits, maybe for not using as much water. You have a reduced water rate. Maybe for things such as xeriscaping, drought-tolerant plants, drip irrigation, encouraging that and offering economic benefits to individuals in the community. So what I thought was interesting was something that you had mentioned to me, and I want to share that with everybody. You said the most water usage comes from watering lawns, and I checked with our utility department, and that is indeed correct. And by the way, you also said that it is the #1 irrigated crop in the United States, the lawn.
So, Steve, can you follow up a little, just with a clarification? You had shared with us that there's a really, it's kind of important to be successful to follow a certain order with this idea of stewardship and practices. And so can you talk a little bit more about that?
So there does seem to be an order, a priority of success when you're dealing with the land. These three things in this order. First and foremost is that land stewardship ethic that we just talked about. That has to drive everything else. But that alone is not enough. Secondly, the person has to have knowledge and understanding of the ecological principles, the things that drive the soil and the water and the plants and the animals. That's the science of the land. That's also necessary. That comes usually after the stewardship. But then the third component is the actual selection and implementation of practices that are chosen to carry out, whatever the objectives are. So with those three things, really, the person, the individual, is engaging first their heart, and that's the stewardship, that's the inner convictions. Secondly, they engage their mind, but there's so much knowledge that a person has to have to do this stuff successfully. And then thirdly would be the hands, the pocketbook, doing the actual work on the land. All three are important. Too often, we tend to jump right to the practices and doing the work, but it's really important to precede that with the stewardship ethics and the knowledge of these ecological principles.
So yeah, that it's really seductive to basically want to make a difference. Just hop in there and do something, but really understanding those underlying ideas and having that heart is really important. And this kind of moves us to our second major topic. So one of the things that we hear is that slowing water down is really important. And we hear that throughout discussions with water and by good land stewards. So, Jeff, if you can, as someone who's practiced restoration and worked on land management on multiple landscapes, so can you talk about some important aspects to understand about this concept of slowing water down?
Well, I want to begin with something that's very important to my organization and many conservation organizations, and that is that in North America, we've lost 62% of the grasslands to either brush encroachment or crop conversion. And in the Chihuahuan Desert, that's, shrub encroachment is the guilty party there. It's not really crop conversion. And with shrub encroachment, we have more bare ground, less vegetative cover, which means rainfall lands right on the ground. It's not intercepted by as many plants. And that action of the rainfall hitting the ground knocks the dirt clods apart, drives fine particles into pore spaces, and that seals off the ground. So we get all this runoff that then, at some point becomes very erosive, has lots of erosive power. And we see the same things along streams where the forests that used to be along our streams, and in some cases still are, catch the rain as well. They also provide another benefit in that when the monsoons come and we get flows in those streams, those trees, sometimes shrubs, like baccharis and other things, they slow water and they force that in a functioning stream. They put that water gets on the floodplain, it gets slowed more, that water gets stored, infiltrated into the floodplain, into those stream deposits, and gets stored there. So by those plants serve us benefit by slowing the water and increasing natural storage, what I like to call natural distributed storage on the landscape.
So you talked a little bit about the idea of riparian and floodplains. So can you just, we've got a slide up. Can you just make sure everybody knows what a riparian area
sure.
and a floodplain are?
Okay. I think everybody knows what a stream channel is, it's the eroded space. And there's often a terrace or two above that. And the low one is what we would call the floodplain. And that's normally, and you can see here, they'd say it's the 1 year flood. Some hydrologists say 1.5 or 2 year flood. It really depends on what area of the country you're in. But we all know what a flood is. We've seen them. And that gets up out of the channel and onto the floodplain. And those floodplain soils are often deep, deeper than on the uplands, at least in West Texas, and have a capacity to store lots of water. And because they store water, they can grow big trees, cottonwoods, willows, sometimes ash, sycamores. And so we've got, it looks like 2 terraces in this graph, and you'll see that the first terrace, the lower terrace, has small trees on it because it gets flooded and disturbed more often, and then a higher terrace where the trees get more established because they don't get flooded with as much water, with as much velocity, and as often. So
Yes, thank you. So one of the things we've been hearing is, the kind of the importance, and Jeff touched on that, of, grass and then trees along our riparian areas. But we have shrubs too. And so, Steve, can you talk a little bit about the importance of shrubs in slowing water down as well?
Well, of course, we all appreciate a good grass cover for slowing down the water, for protecting the soil. For sure, that's important. But it's interesting to understand that brush also slows down the water, and brush also can protect the soil perhaps better than what we have been told. And so it's actually been found that infiltration rates underneath the brush canopy are often greater than in the inner spaces. So it's not about having all brush or all grass. It's about having a balanced landscape where there's healthy grasslands, there's brushy cover, and when that combination is well managed, it's good for ranching, it's good for wildlife habitat, it's good for it's a good hydrologic cover. So it's you can have a combination of those things and be better than if the landscape was all one or all the other. So it's really more about balance, I think.
So, Casey, you have an opportunity to really manage kind of the entirety of a system. So, kind of thinking about this idea of managing that entire system for water, how do you kind of approach or think about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, when we start thinking about these systems, to think holistically, to really think about this is an entire interconnected system that is just extremely complex. I mean, our technology these days hasn't even begun to touch the level of complexity that these natural systems function in. So to just go ahead and accept that and know it, and know that we can only manage and know in part, but like Steve has said in our stewardship ethic, is to just be a lifelong learner and continue to gain knowledge so that we can understand these systems as a whole and how they function, and look at them in that way. I think it's really important also, if we're looking at it in terms of from a ranching perspective, we're really, if we get down to the nitty gritty, we're just trying to make use of every single drop of rain or every single gallon of upstream flow that is coming through our ranch. And so by having a functioning system, we're more able to do that. And if that system is functioning properly, we can increase grass production, forage production, which can in turn, we can increase production and producer profits on the ranch, like Steve mentioned a minute ago. But that doesn't have to come necessarily at the expense of the land. If we're managing properly and we're increasing our knowledge, then we can hopefully, we have plenty of forage available, which every blade of that grass and every forb and shrub is a little rain catching machine. So we have increased forage, then we can have increased infiltration, which can lead to increased forage, which could lead to increased animals or livestock on the land. And hopefully, if those are managed properly, then they are increasing the nutrient cycle, which is in turn creating healthy soil, which in turn increases infiltration, which makes more grass. So, we're helping with correct management. Hopefully, we're being a part of that entire system at every level.
So thank you, Casey. So one of the things that really came up as we were having conversations about slowing the water down was how important terminology was. And so one of the things that Jeff and Steve brought up was the difference between using the word watershed versus water catchment. So if you could basically just share, what's the difference between those two terms?
Okay, well, in America, we're taught to use the term watershed. We all know what that means, and that's what have been taught.
in earth science class. But in Australia, in Africa, and in Europe, they don't use that term. They use the term water catchment. And really, they're ahead of us in that respect. They're using a term that is more descriptive of how we want the land to function. We want the land to catch the water, to hold the water, to slow the water down. We don't want to manage our landscapes to shed water or speed water up like from the roof of a barn or from a parking lot. So it's just terminology, but we try to get people to think water catching landscapes, water slowing landscapes, making the very best use of every drop that falls.
And this is why many land managers say leave half, right? And it's pretty obvious on the picture up there what side is catching water and which side is shedding water. And I think the picture illustrates the concept pretty well.
Yes, and so we're going to start talking now, really kind of coming in, to the next step, which is the practices. So, this is one thing that, everybody, really wants to focus on, what practices can we do? But again, this is really kind of the last step in that process. Casey, can you kind of start us out and really talk a little bit about how the Dixon Water Foundation approaches grazing as a water management practice?
Sure. So, we at Dixon, we really focus on grazing management, and that's mainly because on most of these agricultural lands, they have some type of grazing operation, and so cattle or livestock are the tool at hand. They may not have some of the other tools that Leopold talks about, but we know if they have some kind of ag operation, they have livestock, and so just managing those can create a huge amount of change. But I think the first thing that's really important that a producer, that a land manager needs to consider, especially here in the Chihuahuan Desert, and I think earlier today we looked at a slide that showed the real difference between the elevation, the rainfall due to elevation out here. So we need to look at what part of the Chihuahuan Desert is your ag operation in, and does your grazing operation fit that part? There's so many different choices. Just because an operation has historically been, say, a cow-calf operation, doesn't mean that it always has to be that. It might, a seasonal stocker setup could really fit that ecoregion and that rainfall zone much better than a cow-calf operation could. Or maybe even looking at totally different species other than cattle, or any number of different choices. So I think that might be the first thing to look at. But then, second, what we do at Dixon is we implement an AMP, or adaptive multi-pasture grazing program, on our ranches. And it's not, it's a management tool, and it's not meant to be prescriptive. It's a set of guidelines that can be adapted to your specific operation. But, the main points behind it and what we're trying to do is, one is consolidate cattle, try to create one herd as much as possible. And that way, those animals aren't just continually lounging or hanging out in riparian zones, riparian corridors, or drainages, where life is easy and there's shade and everything. We actually consolidate them and force them to utilize areas of the ranch where they wouldn't go to unless they were forced to go to. So, and then also by consolidating those animals, we can move them around and start creating long recovery periods between graze periods, so that during those long recovery periods, all of the different grass and forb species have a lengthy time to be able to recuperate and recover from the graze period. So that can help increase plant diversity as well. So there's some species that just don't handle grazing pressure as well as other species do. So it gives them a chance to flourish. And then also, by consolidating those animals and moving them around, we're actually improving and increasing the nutrient and mineral cycling. So we're having a short duration graze period with a massive influx of animals that can disturb the soil, open it, break it up, break up the soil capping, and then deposit nutrients that can be utilized, so it increases soil health, which again can increase infiltration and carbon sequestration, which also makes the soil more like a sponge. So I think that's really important, and I think also just in more philosophical terms, when we're talking about management tools, I think we as land managers need to keep in mind, I think a lot of times we start managing for the negatives, or we see something that we don't want and we manage towards that. When in reality, we need a clear picture of what it is that we do want, and we need to manage towards that. Now, we might be dealing with brush species that we don't want or something like that, but overall, let's have a picture of a healthy system, a healthy functioning system, and start make that our bullseye instead of just going after that one weed or brush species that we really hate.
So, Steve, you had mentioned earlier that you had the opportunity through your career to work with a lot of really good land stewards. So, can you share your ideas on grazing in the Chihuahuan Desert in this kind of rough environment?
Well, again, what I'm going to say is what I've observed and learned from successful ranchers. And so I think it's important to begin with the premise of sustainable livestock production. And that premise is that there's a reliable surplus of grass, some of which can be harvested and used as forage. But the remaining part that's not grazed must remain on site. That's what provides protection of the soil from sun and from rain, protects it from erosion, maintains the health of the grassland itself. So grass that is not grazed does not go to waste. It's really important for the perpetuation and improvement of that system. So the Trans-Pecos is about 20 million acres, more or less. Within that 20 million acres, about 80% of the Trans-Pecos is true desert, being defined as about 10 inches or less rainfall. That's typically below 4,500 feet in elevation. The other 20% gets more rain, it's higher in elevation, it's much better ranching country, but it's not desert. So we have both desert and non-desert in the Trans-Pecos. In the desert parts, i.e. 10 inches or less average, that premise of a reliable surplus of grass does not exist in most years. And what that means, taking what Casey said about you have to match your management to your area, it means that you can't have ongoing livestock operation because there's not ongoing grass production. So the grazing has to be intermittent and periodic. When you have a surplus, yes, you take advantage of it, but probably not with a cow-calf operation. As Casey mentioned, probably something like with stockers. So there's a way to ranch in the desert, but it's a lot different than ranching in other areas. It takes a lot more skill, a lot more finesse. It's a very, very tough thing to do, but that would be the things that I think I've learned from these successful ranchers. It's not a full-time thing in the desert.
So thank y'all for sharing about grazing. Now, Jeff, as a hydrologist, can you talk about some practices that can be used in landscapes and riparian areas to address some specific issues, particularly of erosion and runoff?
Well, first let's talk about those issues. Anyone who's spent time looking at old historic photos or reading old historic accounts knows that we've had some very obvious changes to our streams and our uplands even, but specifically on our streams, I want to want you to consider that when the settlers first got here, there was a lot of heavy grazing pressure from sheep, goats, cows on the uplands, which removed the vegetation. And we've already discussed what that means for runoff, that there was more runoff. And at the same time, the mines in Terlingua, Mariscal, Shafter, they all needed timber. So we logged, they needed lots of timber. And the easiest timber to log first was the stuff that was close by. So many of our riparian forests suffered from that. And again, those are the trees along the streams. And so when that increased runoff got to the streams, there was no forest to slow that water down. So that water just excavated lots of gravel. That's why we see lots of steep banks in especially the lower third or half of our Terlingo Creek, Alameda Creek, our big watersheds out here. So now the flows just rush right on by, and they don't get up onto the floodplain. Those riparian forests are not recovering. You can visit some of those riparian forests, and there's very little recruitment. There's no new trees, or very few anyway. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to bring practices that are old, and I mean, these are not new ideas, and there have been, implemented throughout the desert Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico, and that's basically building filter dams, some kind of way to slow the water, not stop it completely, but slow the water, catch some of the coarser sediments, the sand and the gravels, and help rebuild the bottom of that stream. So the picture you see up there, the one in the center is what we call a brush weir, and that is just posts driven into the stream bottom and then brush woven in. And then the two on the right are loose rock structures. So you can go online and look up Bill Zedike or Joe Wheaton or any of these guys that are have been talking about these ideas for quite some time. There are other types of filter dams, media lunas, Zuni bowls, trincheras. These are all sort of old ideas of using loose rocks to catch that water. And the value of the beauty of this is that it's low tech and low risk, and it's low cost, not only to implement but to maintain, because that's something we forget about. Everything that we do when we're trying to repair something requires repeated effort. If you're going to try to reduce brush on your place, you're going to do that every so often. And we know from looking at these structures that sometimes you may need to go back and play with them a little bit and fix where they got knocked over by a cow or something. But these are low cost, low risk, and easy to maintain. So we're advocating for some of these in appropriate spaces, and we combine this tool with other tools of planting trees or some other vegetation project. And again, it goes back to what Steve said earlier, is that we have a bunch of tools, right? And we need to pick and choose from those sets of tools. And here in these cases, they worked out really well. Picking your right tool and mixing and matching is pretty important.
So we've been talking about things that, ranchers and rural landowners can do. So Catherine, can you talk a little bit about things that urban landowners can do to help slow water down?
Okay, and there are absolutely things that we can do within an urban setting to slow water down. It doesn't matter if you have half an acre or 1 acre, there are things you can do. And as a community, some of the urban practices that we can incorporate together, and individual landowners could do this on their own at their land, whether it's half an acre or not. Community rain gardens, okay, that would be one that would help to catch the water. Also, curb cuts would help. Anything to capture that water. Permeable surfaces for parking lots, sidewalks, and driveways would also help. And I had mentioned it before, but things such as xeriscaping with drought-tolerant plants, native plants, grasses. So when we think of xeriscape, it's not just rocks and barren. You can use these plants, and that would be beneficial in capturing the water. And then also drip irrigation instead of these big sprinklers that you often see as you drive through the city of Alpine that are going and wasting water. Gutters, rain catchment systems, things like that. can be done, even if you don't have a big piece of land, even if you are living in the city.
So another practice that we've seen that gets applied in urban areas as well as rural areas is basically the use of herbicides to maintain a specific type of, or to restore a specific type of vegetation. And a lot of times we're looking at, really trying to restore grasslands or maintain a grassland as a yard in urban areas. And so I've actually had a lot of experience looking at research, particularly on uplands with grassland restoration with herbicides. And the one that we've really seen applied broadly in the Trans-Pecos is spike or tebuthyron. And we've seen some phenomenal results in getting grasslands back using that herbicide. And so there's almost been the tendencies for some of us to look at that and say, oh my gosh, this is a silver bullet. If we can do this, and we can do this on, thousands of acres, we can get our grasslands back, and then we can have this really great, healthy system. But, as others have shared, there's a lot of different types of vegetation that's going to be important in really maintaining healthy soils. And so I wanted to share a little bit. We've got to look at the other side of a lot of these practices as well. So it's not thinking one and done, it's a silver bullet. So when we talk about spike, what we've seen is we get, scientists, we've been calling it forb shock. We get basically this massive die-off of any kind of perennial forbs. And a forb is basically a broadleaf plant. They're very important for a lot of our wildlife species. And so we've got the grasses back, but now we don't have any forbs, and we may have lost some of our really good browse species of forbs or of shrubs as well. So we need to think about, as we're applying practices, it's not kind of this one and done silver bullet kind of philosophy. So we know that if you come back, 6 or 7 years after you've had a spike treatment and you do prescribed fire, you can really have a really positive forb response to that. And so it's this idea that, okay, we don't have a silver bullet. Management, as Casey said, is very complex, and we really need to kind of think about what we're doing, how we're going to follow that up, and really realizing that every single acre, every pasture, every watershed, every lawn is a unique situation, and we should really plan practices going through kind of that process instead of just going like, oh wow, that practice worked great for my neighbor, so I'm going to do that. It really doesn't work like that. And we need to kind of learn from the past and say, all right, what do we need to do for follow-up? And as we were developing this panel, Jeff really shared about, the Pecos River and some of, the idea, okay, it's one and done, but then now we're looking back and doing that again. So if you can share a little bit about the Pecos River.
So if you haven't read the book Bitter Waters, I suggest reading it. And as I was going through it, when I moved back, I'm a Sul Ross alum, so I came back in 2000. They just finished a project spraying, was it a Mazapir? Or I don't remember what it was, but they were trying to kill the salt cedar or the tamarisk along the Pecos River. So I think it went from the state line all the way to Independence Creek, or it was a long stretch of river. And the point they were trying to do, the thing they were trying to do was kill all those trees that are sucking up all the water, right? We need water in the river. So they did it, and they didn't make more water. But I learned from the book that they'd done the same darn thing 20 years before. And there were reports out there, and there was information out there. So, we don't learn from each other. We don't learn from the people that had the job before us. Yeah, it's just, we need to pay attention and be a little more careful. All the things that we've talked about are not something, as Steve has said very eloquently, that, you just go and do. You need to think about it, and you need to, I feel, is Casey's point out, it's very complex. it takes more than just one person. I feel like you should bring in a team. If your neighbor's done something, talk to them. If you've got technical guidance from the university, bring them in, and think about it a long time before you do it.
So really, thinking about this idea of land stewardship and what's happening, we're talking about private lands, whether it's somebody's yard or somebody's ranch, but how do we really think about that as benefiting the overall public? So Catherine, can you talk a little bit about how you feel like management inside of Alpine and outside of Alpine really helps benefit the public?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Flood mitigation, for one. Alpine has what we call a gravity-fed flood control system. And the beauty of that is that Mother Nature does all the work. We don't have to have a stormwater system. We don't have to have costly equipment. We do have a couple of boosters, but not as many as would be needed. So the design of that is that there are concave places within the roads of the city of Alpine for any water that does end up running off into the streets will get caught in these concave areas, and they will be filtered to Alpine Creek and other little creeks around the area. And that is a tremendous benefit. Now, upstream, as ranchers and landowners are conscious of trying to catch every drop of water, that's going to help the city being downstream to help prevent that. And as homeowners also, as I mentioned before, having the plants and the grasses and stuff such as that, rain catchment systems, that's going to help to also prevent that flooding, which will help us tremendously.
So, and that is really, something that we all like to think about. It is, private land, but we're really trying to benefit the public, and there is, that connection. So, Jeff, Casey, and Steve, can you kind of touch on that idea of private land, public benefit with, you talked a little bit about distributed natural water storage before, Jeff, and how does that benefit, the general public?
Earlier we heard talk about reservoirs and that there's a dozen or so out there that might get made. And we saw an evaporation map. And if you spend a little time with the evaporation research, you'll learn that an open water body loses a lot more water than a piece of ground, like a floodplain. The evaporation rates are much greater, 2-3 times, sometimes greater. So if we can store water in our riparian zones, in the floodplains, in sediment, within watershed, and then that stream becomes rehydrated, like we're seeing throughout New Mexico, into Nevada and Utah, streams that were perennial that had dried out are now perennial again. So if we can store that water, make those streams wet again, the downstream users benefit from getting, a reliable water source all year long. It's a higher quality, and then they rely on that reservoir water or that groundwater pumping less. So these restoration practices benefit all of us. That's my view.
So Casey, looking at your ranch and how does that, managing that as a good system benefit the public?
Yeah, so the Mims Ranch, Alameda Creek comes down from the Davis Mountains and then straight across the Mims Ranch and then right through Marfa. So, what we do on that ranch has a huge effect on the city of Marfa and people downstream. But and I know this conference is about water, but if we have a healthy hydrological cycle, then say, for instance, the town of Marfa is going to have reduced flood flow and cleaner runoff that comes through town and all of those water benefits. But there's also, with that healthy functioning hydrological cycle, we're going to have, again, better soil that soaks up more water and carbon. We're going to have plenty of food for wildlife. We're going to have, great habitat. We'll have habitat for pollinators, for migratory birds that come down from the northern United States and Canada. These systems, again, are all interconnected, and so we're going to have benefits that really know no fence lines. Whether the neighbor is across the fence or miles and miles downstream, those benefits are going to go to them as well.
So, Steve, to kind of wrap us up, can you share, because, you know, a lot of your career was also focused on this private land public benefit. So can you kind of share your philosophy of that?
Well, it's one of the core truths of conservation that what happens on privately owned farms and ranches and forests benefits other people. And so a lot of the programs that have been talked about, and there's going to be some more discussion later this afternoon about various conservation programs. These are taxpayer-funded programs. They're allocated out to various agencies and through foundations and grants and whatnot. The purpose of those programs that provide what we used to call cost share, now we call it incentives, but the purpose of that is not just to defray the high cost of brush control or cross fencing or putting out water. The purpose is that there will be a tangible public benefit, and so that what happens on private lands does affect and benefit other people. So it's a message that we need to continue to teach at every level in the schools, is that we're a private land state, obviously, and what happens on farms and ranches benefits every man, woman, and child in this state. And so we just need to be relentless at defending that. And it's a win-win situation because it's good for the landowner to get some assistance, but it's also good for the taxpayer and the cities and the towns and really everyone.
So just to wrap up, we'll be around. I don't know if we have time for questions. Okay, so we do have a few minutes for questions. But I would like to say, you know, one of the things that we really urge everyone to do is, one, you know, learn, be educated, and really, you know, follow that idea of heart, mind, and hands when you're approaching land stewardship and management for water. So do we have any questions?
Casey, so when you're shaping that bullseye to are you, how much do you look to the past historic conditions and versus looking forward to expected future conditions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I do look to the past quite a bit, but I also, I feel like I try to be a realist. So I know that there are species that, say of grasses that are on the ranch that weren't there previously. And if it's a healthy functioning system, then I'm not going to get too bothered by that. I'm not trying to take it back to some Eden-like state that it was at prehistory. You know, that would be nice, but I don't know that we'll ever get there. The main thing is I want the past to be able to inform what I'm doing now, but really, at the end of the day, I just want healthy functioning ecosystem. Yeah.
I don't know if this is the time for this question or comment, but I'm a retired petroleum engineer / geologist, and I think the comment of silver bullets and considering everything, when people talk about use of like desalination of water, there are a lot of brackish water reservoirs that are possibilities in Texas. I'm concerned with produced water. My career was actually on-site supervision of oil and gas wells. A lot of chemicals go in those wells. And, you know, I know over the years that many things we figure out and solve problems. And one of those problems will be identifying all those things and testing for all of those before we go and put it on the land. Okay, that's just my comment.
We have time for a couple more questions if.
Coming right here, coming across.
This is just more of a comment than a question, but I wanted to thank you all for addressing the relationship between rural stewardship and urban stewardship. And I wanted to point out that as much as landowners and ranchers and farmers contribute to the well-being of their community, hopefully we can also, those of us who live in urban spaces can do like you had mentioned, and maybe water our crop less, less, and hopefully return the favor of keeping some of that water in the aquifer, for the ranchlands as well, and vice versa. So I appreciate that.
Can I say, it is possible to have a lawn of native grasses if you're willing for it to be brown in the dry months. It's possible. You can have a buffalo grass lawn, and they're very nice. And you know what? They only grow like this tall, so you don't really have to mow much. So, anyway, lawns aren't bad as long as it's a native.
So I think, do we have time for one more question if we've got any?
Hey, yeah, so my question has to do with, these practices are really exciting, and these principles are really, seem pretty obvious. What do you think the main obstacle is to getting them applied more widely? Is it money? Is it manpower? Is it expertise? Is it education? How can we get these things more widespread?
So I would say, and all of us up here are involved in education as well as putting these practices on landscapes at different levels. And so, in some ways, it is really, really important for education. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important to have this conference and to do these types of things, because the more we know, the more, it's even education on resources. So if you say, well, economics is the big barrier, well, there are a lot of resources to help with economics. And so I really think, for all of us, education is that what we need to be doing. And I don't know, you can go look. I think they're on YouTube. Steve Nelly has a great set of videos on riparian health and understanding riparian health. The Dixon Water Foundation does a ton of really good, field tours, getting folks out on the landscape where you can learn. So I think anybody in this room, if you've got the ability, to help educate around water, we don't really have a lot of water curriculum in our K through 12. And so I think from my perspective, that is really, the biggest barrier, the biggest hurdle that we need to get over to really help with, the idea of practices. And I don't know if any of y'all have.
I want to second that.
I would agree. Education is it, and also just I think sometimes change is just difficult, and it's risky, and especially in ag where the margins are so thin. Then, if it doesn't work, well then you're in trouble. So, so education, and then also just helping producers be able to implement change is important as well.
On the stream side, access to manpower is pretty tough. Those loose rock structures, those rock dams you saw earlier, we built those with high school students. So that's one way to teach, but it was labor. And when we build those brush weirs, finding the contractors has been a struggle. We're sitting in a good place now, but I think we're going to need some more. So, the labor market's a challenge too.
And I think that ties in with education, learning how to do those things. Because in some of the ways, some of these things are kind of a lost art. So I guess we'll end that with that kind of emphasis on, yeah, let's all keep learning.